First thing to realize is that the anxiety, the pain, the distress, the depression, the alienation that people are experiencing, they're not the problem. They're the manifestations of a problem. Actually, they're signs. If I experience anxiety or depression, that's a sign from my body and my mind telling me there's something out of alignment in my life. So it's not a question of how do I get rid of the depression. I mean, we want to, for sure, recover from it. But in order to do so, we have to say, well, what is this telling me about how I live my life? And what do I need to change? We see these conditions or these mind states as signs. And then we have to say, well, what is it signaling? That's the first point. The second point is, these can't be individual problems. I mean, if it was happening to the isolated individual here or there occasionally, we'd say, well, maybe it's an individual issue. But when it's happening on a large scale, it's got to be something cultural. It's got to be something that's happening in a society that's driving so many people to, literally driving them to despair. So what we're looking at is a cultural problem here. And the cultural problem we're looking at is that this society stresses a lot of people. Now, if you look at the sources of stress in the scientific literature, the major triggers for the stress response are uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, and conflict. Now, uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, and conflict. I think I've just described this culture. How many people lack a sense of agency and control in their lives? I'm going to give you a trivial example. When Elon Musk buys Twitter, and overnight he fires 7,500 people. And he tells the other 7,500, you can show up to work, but you're going to work harder and longer. That's 15,000 people. Multiplied by them with their families, that's about 40,000 people probably being affected by the decision of one guy. Well, talk about loss of control. You don't control whether you work or not, and you don't control the conditions of your work. That's a major source of stress for people. The uncertainty of what's going to happen next. The United States, richest country in the history of the world, more than half the population lives 2 paychecks away from bankruptcy. I mean, talk about uncertainty. And then there's all the traumas that people are carrying, that, what happened to them as children, and the lack of secure attachments and acceptance for who they were, the need to fit in, the constant competition. These are conditions that could be almost designed to make people anxious and depressed and hostile and very insecure. First thing to realize is there's nothing wrong with you. Your depressions, your anxieties, they're normal responses to an abnormal situation. So don't take it personally. Don't take on shame. Don't think there's something wrong with you. And then secondly, given that so much of it has to do with loss of control and uncertainty, look at your life and see where in your life does uncertainty and lack of information and loss of control show up. Look at every aspect of it, whether it's in your personal relationships or your work or whatever you're doing. And what can you do to gain some agency? And if you can't gain agency because of your circumstances, then at least understand that this is how it is and you'll have to adjust to it. But don't think that there's something wrong with you. Now, there are more specific things I can suggest, but the beginning has to do with an understanding that it didn't start with you and there's nothing wrong with you, and you have to look at the whole context of your life, not just try and get rid of a symptom. If you have an addiction, rather than seeing it, whether it's to sex or gambling or pornography or to substances or to alcohol or whatever, or shopping or eating, or first of all, ask yourself not what's wrong with the addiction. Ask yourself not what's wrong with the addiction, what's right about it. What's it doing for me? And most people will say, it soothes me, or it numbs me, or it gives me stress relief, or it gives me a sense of control. In other words, recognize that the addiction is not your primary problem. It's your attempt to solve a problem. The problem of emotional pain, of emotional loss, of stress, and so on. So rather than making yourself wrong for the addiction, ask yourself, well, where have I lost control? Why do I have so much emotional pain? What happened to me? Why am I living under so much stress? So begin with, again, actually looking at each of these problems in context. Rather than making isolated problems out of them, look at them in context. And when it comes to stress, there are, broadly speaking, 2 kinds of stresses. I mean, you can look at stress in a whole number of ways, but One way to look at this is as follows. There's stresses that life brings your way that you can't do much about. If where you live there's going to be a tornado, there's going to be a tornado. There's nothing you can do to prevent a tornado. You could, in the long term, move to some part of the world where there are no tornadoes or less chance, but most people don't have that kind of options. So some things we can't do much about. At least in the immediate sense, you can't control inflation. The government could, and those that have the economic power could, but they have no interest in doing so. That's all of the story. But you can't. So there's some stresses there's not much you can do about. But then there's a whole lot of stresses that we generate for ourselves. And those stresses that we generate from ourselves have, broadly speaking, two sources. Let's say I'm supposed to be on this podcast, but let's say the link didn't work. I could say the link didn't work, too bad, we'll try again some other day. Or I could get all upset about it. It's so frustrating. One more time, it didn't work. What's wrong with this technology? And I'm going to miss this opportunity to publicize my book. And what's that going to mean? And, I really wanted to express my opinions. And I'm always going to, in other words, I could make a whole story out of it. And that would really stress me, Now, look at the stories that you're making up when stuff happens. Because it's not what happens that stresses you. In this case, there's nothing particularly stressful about a podcast being technologically impaired, or delayed. If I make up a big story around it, I'm really going to stress myself. So we stress ourselves by the stories that we tell ourselves. A friend of yours says, let's go for coffee, and then they cancel. Well, you could make up a story that I'm not lovable, or they don't love me, or they're undependable, and why is everybody like that, and why is this always happening to me? That would really stress you. Or you could say, too bad, I'll just get on with my day. So a lot of the stress is the stories that our minds make up around events that happen, and those stories are rooted in trauma. Because if you get upset because your friend didn't show up for coffee, it's because you had some abandonment in childhood, and you still have that wound. So one way to de-stress is to deal with our traumas. Now, the second source of stress that we make up is the stuff that we take on because we don't say no. That some people grow up believing that if they say no to others' demands, expectations, then they're selfish, or then they won't be liked, they're not lovable, they have to earn the world's respect, they have to earn the world's validation, so they don't say no, they take on too much, and that really stresses them. So one of the exercises I recommend is that you ask yourself, where am I not saying no? Where there's a no that wants to be said, but I'm not saying it. That's how the exercise begins. Now it has got 5 other questions. But once a week, sit down and ask yourself, where this week did I not say no? Where no wanted to be said, but I didn't utter it because I was afraid to. And that usually shows up in 2 aspects of life, work and personal relationships. And that no that you don't say. Like if I asked you, Doug, has it happened to you ever that you wanted to say no, you didn't feel like doing something, but you said yes anyway? What's the impact on you when you do that? So the impact is pretty huge, of not saying no. Over the things that we can control, the stories that we tell ourselves, and where we don't say no. If we learn how to deal with them, those would be huge mitigators of the stress that we live under. And again, some stresses, oh my gosh, there was an article in the New York Times just this last weekend about what happens to black mothers and children around birth. And they do a lot worse. Rich black women do worse than poor white women. They're more likely to die. Their babies are more likely to die. And they didn't cause that. That's the stress of racism. And not just around birth itself, but lifelong, because lifelong racism affects the physiology of the body. Now, those are stresses that nobody caused for themselves. If they get enough support and heal, they could possibly resist the effects of that kind of stress. But the stress is coming from a society that is fundamentally still suffused with racism. Well, that you didn't cause. If you're a black person, you didn't cause the racism. If you're a white person, you didn't cause the racism either. You inherited it. It's part of the culture. So some stresses are social ones, and we have to deal with them on a social level. But on a personal level, the belief that I have to be strong and invulnerable, and I must never talk about my feelings. The rising and gender unequal rate of suicide. So men are more likely to commit suicide. Men are also more likely to commit violence against women. So there's something about the way this culture programs men that encourages aggression, either against the self or against other people. That's not the fault of individual men, nor is it an issue of biological gender. There's no genes for suicide. Why would there be? Nor is there a gene for violence against women. Why would there be? But if people become depressed, and for example, in the United States, 2 economists wrote a book about what they call deaths of despair. One of them was a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And what's happened is that in the industrial heartland of the United States, where industrial jobs evaporated over a couple of decades, they were exported basically to countries where there's cheaper labor, so that the well-paying, reasonably well-paying unionized jobs and job security and sense of purpose and meaning and belonging of men all of a sudden was taken away from them. That wasn't their fault. But belonging and contributing and having a sense of meaning and purpose are essential human needs. So when all of a sudden that's taken away from men, and now they can't provide for their families the way they used to be able to, their sense of own value diminishes. Now they're more likely to become addicted and try and soothe their pain through substances. So you have this high rate of overdose deaths. In the United States last year, over 100,000 people overdosed. Almost twice as many people overdosed in the States as Americans who died in the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan wars put together in 1 year. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason isn't an individual one. It's a social one. It's a society that takes away a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging from people, which leaves them in despair. Now they're going to escape into addictions or kill themselves. And these have been called deaths of despair. It's not a question of working on the future or the past. It's working on the present. Because here's the deal. Trauma is not what happened to us. Trauma is what happened inside us as a result of what happened to us. I got the message in the first year of my life that I wasn't wanted. Okay? The trauma is not the war and the genocide amidst which I spent my first year. That wasn't the trauma. Those were the traumatic events. The trauma was the wound, which is my belief that I wasn't wanted and I'm not worthy. That's the trauma. But that's the good news. Because if the trauma was what happened to me, that was 78 years ago. It's over and done with. I can't change the past. I'll never not have been born as a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation. That'll never not have happened. Whatever happened to you, that'll never not have happened. But if the trauma is my belief that I'm not worthy, I can heal that in the present. And healing the present. So it's not a question of changing the past. It's a question of changing your relationship to the past in the present moment. So I could be embittered, and believe me, I have been, about the death of my grandparents in Auschwitz. I could be embittered about my infancy, and believe me, I have been. Or I could be damn grateful that I survived and have been able to pursue work and relationships that have been so meaningful to me. But it all depends on which angle I'm looking at it from. As long as I'm looking at it from a traumatic angle, I'm just embittered and despondent. I can't change the past, but I can change the present. Now, needless to say, I'm not giving you a formula. I'm just telling you my personal story. If I could look at it in this world, and on a bad day, by the way, I still don't. But if I can look at this world as a world in which there's a place for me, in which I can find meaning and love, my future is very different. So it's the present we need to work on. We need to work on what beliefs and body states do we hold in the present that limit us. If we deal with that present, the future will take care of itself. I've had moments when I didn't think life was worth living, and I imagined my own suicide. Never that I planned it or I was going to do it, but I kind of fantasized it, you know? I've been to those places, so I get it. I feel that the world's against me. That's not a feeling. It's a belief, okay? If you have that belief, it's because at some point you had that experience. But you're not having that experience right now. That experience was that of a child who was helpless and alone. So what's showing up in your belief system is not your present situation, but your childhood emotional experience. And like I said before, in the present we can heal. No matter what happened then, we can heal in the present. Are you willing to consider that healing is possible for you? Or have you totally given up? By the way, a person who's totally given up wouldn't be telling you this. Because when people talk this way, whether they know it or not, they're asking for help. If they weren't asking for help, they wouldn't say anything. They just slink off of their own and isolate themselves. And as some people do. Don't try and solve this on your own. We're human beings. We're creatures that evolved in connection and community. You're not alone with this. It may feel like you're alone, and you certainly might feel lonely, but you're not in fact alone. Millions feel exactly the same way. And they're not crazy, and you're not crazy. Those beliefs and feelings are normal responses to abnormal circumstances.